in terms of how have I seen racial inequity issues or equity issues manifest in the work, I think is one big way is around Social Security. And the founding of Social Security, the creation of Social Security, that certain people were omitted, like domestics. And so it coming into this work, I didn't know that a person could work for decades and decades and not be eligible for Social Security. And the first client that I ran into that had that situation, I saw a need for her to be enrolled in some Medicare waiver programs and went to apply for them for her, assist her in applying, and found out that she wasn't eligible for anything. And she had worked her entire life since she was a teenager, and she was, now in her 80s and had only recently probably retired within the last 10 years from then. She worked well into her 70s and did not qualify for these programs. And I had to educate myself about Social Security and the history of Social Security. And so that's one big way that I've seen it manifest over and over again. The inability for certain people to access Medicare waivered programs because they don't qualify for Social Security, and that it's not a coincidence, that it was purposeful, that was put in there. I think another thing that I see is in people's homes. A lot of people, their wealth is in their home, but through a history of redlining, that for older people of color, they don't have that wealth built into their home, and they cannot leverage that wealth that others can in order to provide for their own needs. So I've seen that over and over again as well. People who have been professionals and they moved into the only neighborhoods they could during the time, which were Black neighborhoods, and then over the years to have their home values devalued purposely through redlining. It has really hurt the standing of a lot of older people of color, older Black individuals. And then you move into the latest iteration of that, which is not only did redlining depress the value of their homes, but now you have these predators who are going out and trying to buy up their homes for even less than what they're worth so that they can then gentrify those communities. And so I think those things combined, you really see racial inequity in that. I think currently you still see a lot of inequity around healthcare. Access to healthcare, and some of that again goes back to the discussion I had about Social Security. But then you also see, advanced lab work that isn't being done sometimes for people who are Black or on the lower end of the socioeconomic scale, as well as issues of believing them, when they complain about pains or aches or ailments, having those concerns taken seriously, I think is also an issue that comes up. And so I think if in the social service field, if you're not aware of those inequities, then maybe you're not advocating as strongly as you need to be. I think we all in our society have a tendency of trusting the medical professionals. If the doctor says they don't need this, then they don't need it. If the doctor says that this isn't serious, then it isn't serious. Versus if and you've been educated about inequities that are built into even our healthcare system, then you can advocate more strongly. So I think some of the issue is just in the social service field, maybe not having that level of education. As I said earlier, I had to, once I realized and started seeing things, had to go back and educate myself so that I would be more aware of why are these things happening the way they're happening? And what's the history behind it? And so I think in the social service field, those of us who are educators in that field have to do a better job of broaching these topics and talking about the history. And so I think the more you know, the more you can do. And so I see that issue very strongly. There are a lot of things coming to mind. I think also we don't just, and I know we're talking about in the field of elder justice, but for most APS workers around the country, they deal both with elders as well as people with disabilities. Mm-hmm. And one of the big things we see are, the issues of mental health disabilities. And mental health disabilities don't go away with age, although some people would like to think so, that you turn 60 or 65 and all of a sudden we're dealing with aging issues and not necessarily mental health anymore. But the way in which people with mental health issues are seen, and then I think that carries on to people of color with mental health issues, and then definitely men and Black men in particular with mental health issues, how they are seen as a danger. They're seen as a threat. And that issue comes up time and time again. I think one of the things that I also train on that that deals with racial issues is how we engage law enforcement. Mm-hmm. I have always said, one, gut, make sure that, but at the time, if there are ways to intervene with someone who is having a mental health crisis without engaging law enforcement, then let's try those other avenues first. If we can get a mental health crisis line on board, if we can engage with, people that they know and trust to maybe help them in this time of crisis, may be a better way, because we do know that in issues where there has been lethal force used by law enforcement, often there is an underlying issue of mental health there, that law enforcement felt threatened because this person was in a mental health crisis. We even had an issue in Atlanta a few years back where a gentleman was in an apartment complex totally nude. And the neighbors called in to say that he was running around with no clothing on, and he was a veteran and he was having a mental health crisis, and he was seen as a threat and was killed. No clothing on, so therefore there could be no hidden weapon, but that the fact that this person, a Black man, which I don't think can be separated from it, the fact that he was a Black man, having a mental health crisis, was seen as such a threat that it was through lethal force. So I think that's also a big issue. How and when do we engage law enforcement? We want our workers to be safe first and foremost. And so if their gut says that they need to engage law enforcement, I would never want to dissuade someone from doing so. But we also look at who is the client, what is going on with them, and could this potentially result in harm to the client by engaging law enforcement. So I think that's definitely a way in which for our workers that they have to weigh situations and figure out what is the best avenue. We always want to encourage them to engage mental health and any type of services that mental health has. And there will be some type of crisis team that can come out. How can we get that crisis team on site versus law enforcement? In some areas, the crisis team and law enforcement join up and they come out together. That's a benefit as well. But if we're only engaging law enforcement in times of crisis, then those inequities do rear up and present themselves. So that is also something that, we talk about as well in our trainings on law enforcement about when to engage, because yes, it's an equity issue, but a racial issue, but there are lots of people in society who law enforcement coming to their door, they see as a threat, not as a help.
Yeah.
And so how do we maintain rapport with someone when we're showing up with law enforcement? And so that's another issue to think about. It's not always that this person is a threat to themselves or others, but sometimes we engage law enforcement too soon, I think. And we're never able to recover from that to have that level of rapport and respect and confidence that we want our clients to have in us because we came out with law enforcement. So, and that's based on their past interactions with law enforcement and their history with law enforcement in their communities. So, being culturally competent, being aware of the communities that you're working in are all very relevant when we're making decisions about when and how to engage law enforcement. ACL has done a really good job of identifying core competencies, and NYCEAC has done a really good job of, trying to build out objectives and curriculum around those core competencies. And one of the things that NYCEAC did early on is try to embed the idea of the ethics of social work into each one of those modules. But I think that we have opportunities now to go even further beyond just ethics, but issues of equity as well. And because I think every topic you can embed the idea of racial equality into those topics. Building that into trainings, being able to build issues of cultural competency as well as racial equity into everything that we train. So as we are going back and revamping and revising those core competencies in NYCEAC, it's also an opportunity to build in issues of cultural competency and racial equity. NYCEAC currently has recently put together a racial justice, what's the word I'm looking for? Group, advisory board, that's the word. So NYCEAC has recently put together a racial justice advisory board or racial equity advisory board. And so they're starting to look at topics and ways in which we can be on the forefront of this issue and make sure that all of our members are aware of these issues and are better advocates. I think definitely just in my role as a trainer. So anytime that I'm able to go out into the community or train new adult protective services workers or even veteran workers for that matter, to embed that into that training, to bring up the issues of Social Security or redlining in their training, and how can they tackle those issues? How can they better serve those clients? How can they be aware of those issues and not assume that everyone qualifies for the same things or that everyone can pull equity out of their home in order to get the things they need? So those are definitely ways in which I try to incorporate that into my everyday work, is just training new staff to be aware of the issues. I think also maybe tackling their own biases as well is a way in which they can look at this and the cases that they tackle. Do they have their own personal biases that make them either advocate more or less for certain people? If they believe that it is the decisions of an individual that puts them in the situations that they're in, and aren't able to see maybe that there were systems set up that have also contributed to the situation that someone is in, I think can really make a difference in how workers do the work that they do, to self-reflect, but then also recognize that not everyone's situation is self, and that there can be systems and issues of racial inequity that has contributed to that. Uh, Awareness and education about issues related to racial equity, for all of us to be better advocates for all of our clients, regardless of their racial and ethnic backgrounds. Just overall cultural competency so that we can be better advocates, I think, is a big issue. And then hopefully one day some of the systematic inequities that we have to fight against will be reversed, and that we don't have to hard. But right now, there are systematic issues, systemic issues that are going on. And so the only thing we can do now is be aware, educate ourselves, and be the best advocates we can be for the community that we serve. I think this conversation gives me hope. I think, the work that the National Adult Protective Services Association is doing to embed issues of cultural competency and equity and ethics into all of their trainings, the willingness of people of all races to take the time over the past year to do some soul searching about, this nation and where this nation stands with racial equity. Those things give me hope. It saddens me that tragedies have to happen before we have conversations like this. I'm here in Atlanta, where, just 2 weeks ago, we had the spa shootings that have deeply affected the AAPI community, which makes us have, deeper conversations about, how we engage with those in our Asian community. So I'm hopeful, but I'm saddened by what has brought this about. And I hope that we can continue to tackle these issues and not let them go out of our list of priorities until something else tragic happens. Like, let's stay focused. Let's tackle these issues, and let's do what we can from a social service perspective, from an elder justice perspective, and not take our eye off the ball.
Thank you very much for all your responses. It's been a really meaningful conversation, and I think, your own efforts and your legacy really has, made its mark in the space, and we're very grateful for your contributions.